Mom, we're already married. Text me the code to the Cornwall cottage. Tonight. There was no how are you. No, we've got news to share. Just that clipped, almost impatient tone my son uses when he's made up his mind and decided everyone else should simply fall in line. I was standing in the narrow kitchen of Seaforth Cottage, the smell of salt and wet kelp drifting in through the half-open sash window. Outside, the Porthcurno waves were breaking hard against the rocks, the same tides that had carried Arthur's ashes out to sea on a bitter January morning. This house, this stretch of coastline, had kept our family rooted for 4 generations. It was where Callum learned to gut his first mackerel at 7, where Imogen brought her newborns for their first summer, where we weathered the lockdowns together, baking bread we pretended was edible. And now, apparently, it was where my son and his brand new wife, a woman I hadn't even met, wanted to spend their private honeymoon. A honeymoon I hadn't known was happening because I hadn't known there was a wedding. Before I tell you how that conversation ended and what I ended up leaving on their doorstep that had his wife screaming loud enough for the neighbors to hear, make sure you're subscribed. Every week here, we share real British family dramas, love, betrayal, and those rare moments where the tables turn and justice feels almost poetic. I pressed the phone harder to my ear, as if that might make the words change. You got married, I asked, keeping my voice calm, the way you do when a seagull has landed in your kitchen and you're trying not to spook it before you can shoo it out. A registry office in Islington, Callum said, just a few friends. We didn't want the fuss. Ruby's always dreamed of the Cornish coast for her honeymoon. You know, windswept walks, quaint fishing pubs. We'll be down tomorrow for a month, maybe longer. Can you send the code now so I can give it to the removal guys? I looked over at the old tin box on the dresser, its surface dented from years of being moved from one shelf to another. Arthur kept his press passes in there, relics from his days covering dock strikes and political scandals. Now it held other things. The spare keys to the cottage, a photograph of my parents on the cliff path, and the handwritten note Arthur left me about the house. Never let this place be turned into a business. It's our anchor. You didn't think to tell me about the wedding, I asked, aisifree, einchikoise, my fingers tracing the dent in the tin. We wanted it private, he said. No drama, no family politics, but the cottage will be perfect. Ruby's already got outfits planned for the photos she's talking about, starting a little travel blog while we're there. Through the line, I heard her voice, bright and edged, with something I couldn't place. Tell her we'll look after it, better than she does. I closed my eyes, picturing the cottage as it was this morning, the damp slate floor just mopped, the low beams dusted, the smell of the lemon thyme I'd picked from the garden. The idea of strangers, even ones claiming to be family, breezing in as if it were theirs, made my jaw ache. Callum, I said quietly, Imogen's bringing the kids down next week. They've been counting the days since Easter. They can skip a year or get a B&B in Penzance. You've got to admit, Mom, you barely use the place in winter. I felt the familiar pull, the instinct to smooth things over, to rearrange my plans, to let him have what he wanted, because it was easier than the argument. But something in his tone, in Ruby's little aside, snagged at me. It was the same tone he used when he was 12 and tried to borrow my car to impress a girl from school, certain I'd give in, because I always had. Outside, the gulls screamed, the wind rattled the sash, and in the distance, a fishing trawler cut a black line against the gray horizon. I thought of Arthur's note again. Our anchor, I'll think about it, I said, keeping my voice even. What's there to think about? It's just a house. My hand tightened on the tin box. No, Callum, I thought. It's our history. I didn't send the code. Not yet. I left my phone face down on the kitchen counter and busied myself with the kettle. The sete ain't I recite. The water I poured into it was already hot. It was an old trick I'd learned as a young reporter's wife. If your hands are moving, people can't see them shake. Steam curled into the cold kitchen air, fogging the little window above the sink. And for a moment, I watched the beads of condensation gather and run like tiny racing rivers. When I finally picked up the phone again, there was a new message from Callum. Not a question, not a thanks for thinking about it, but a photograph, he and Ruby, grinning in front of Islington Town Hall, holding a certificate. His suit jacket was open, the same one Arthur had worn to our daughter's christening. Ruby wore a white wrap dress, hair perfectly curled, and in her free hand a set of champagne flutes still wrapped in shop tissue. The caption read, Mr. and Mrs. Price, finally making it official. I tapped on Ruby's username. Her profile wasn't private. She'd already posted a carousel, registry office, champagne in a pub garden, a blurry shot of her in a taxi with a large bouquet, and finally, a sunset selfie with Callum somewhere on the South Bank. But what caught my eye was a tag tucked into the corner of that last photo, North Star Resorts. The account belonged to some glossy development company that posted aerial drone shots of luxury hotels and golf resorts, mostly in places with warmer seas than ours. The comments under the post were full of congratulations, but one stood out, a user with a profile picture of a man in a tailored navy suit had written, looking forward to catching up in Cornwall. We have lots to discuss. Ruby had liked it and replied with a single champagne emoji. My thumb hovered over the screen. That creeping sensation, like cold water running along the spine, began to set in. I called Callum back. He answered on the third ring, and from the background noise, I could tell he was outside. Somewhere windy, but not seaside windy. Mom, I'm just heading into a meeting. Quick question, I said. Who's your friend from North Star Resorts? There was a pause, just long enough for my mind to supply half a dozen answers I didn't want to hear. Oh, Gareth. He's a mate of Ruby's from some charity gala thing. Why? Because he commented on your post about catching up in Cornwall. Hi, Gar. Another pause. He just likes the coast. Mom, don't make it weird. His voice had that edge, the one that says he thinks I'm meddling. Listen, I've got to go. Ruby's already packing. We'll be down tomorrow. So if you could just text me the code, that'd be easiest. Before I could respond, the line went dead. I stared at the phone for a long moment, the black screen, reflecting my own frown. The kettle clicked off behind me, the only sound in the kitchen besides the faint whine of the wind through the chimney. I reached for the tin box on the dresser, slid it open, and looked at the keys inside heavy brass ones, with a long history of keeping out strangers. A notification pinged. Ruby had posted again, this time to her stories. A flat lay of an open suitcase on a bed, neatly folded clothes in muted creams and linens, a pair of oversized sunglasses, and in the corner, I got glossy, gloss bayan. Sikosi and Chagos, ein Forinaisi estate agent's brochure for Seaforth Cottage, Bosi and Krekani, and Chikrisi buys Azayanch and an unparalleled opportunity. My breath caught. The photo was artfully framed, so the text was partially obscured, but the image was unmistakable. My front door, its peeling blue paint, the view to the headland beyond. I took a screenshot before the story could vanish. Something in my chest shifted, from unease to something sharper, colder. There was one more thing in the tin box, a postcard Arthur had sent me from a press trip to Norway years before we'd married. On the back, in his hurried scrawl, "Truth always finds a way. Rosie, just have to know where to look." I rubbed my thumb over the words, then set the card down beside the keys. My mobile rang again, but this time it was Imogen. "Mom, Lily's just been telling me about her list of things to do at the cottage this summer. She's so excited. Do you know the first thing she wrote down? Watch the seals from Grandma's window." There was a smile in her voice, but underneath it, I caught the thread of fatigue that comes from managing too many moving parts, 2 kids, a demanding job, and now, apparently, a kerborboing in Koisbroim. There, who thought he could change the family's plans on a whim. "I've just heard from your brother," I said carefully. "He and Ruby are married." A pause, then a low whistle. "Without telling you, or me, registry office yesterday. They want to spend the next month at the cottage. And where are we supposed to go?" I didn't answer, because we both knew the real question was why they were so determined to be here now, in the height of summer, with the entire coast booked out months in advance. After we hung up, I went to the window. Down on the slipway, Mr. Jenkins was unloading his catch. He glanced up and spotted me, raising a hand in greeting, before nodding toward the road behind him. Parked there, just beyond the no parking sign, was a dark Range Rover with tinted windows. A man in a blazer was leaning against it, camera in hand, snapping photos of the cottage as if he were on some official assignment. I stepped outside, the wind snatching at my cardigan. By the time I reached the gate, the man had slipped back into the car. The Range Rover pulled away, tires crunching on gravel, and as it passed, I caught the plate. "Asin, Iuskipiti, a Kikak, Maparni, registration format," the kind used by fleet vehicles. I memorized the digits and went back inside. On impulse, I typed them into an online checker. The result came back instantly. Registered to North Star Resorts Ltd. So it wasn't just idle Instagram comments. They were already looking. I stood in the hallway, the weight of the keys in my hand. If Arthur were here, he'd be at his desk, calling up old contacts, tracing the threads until the whole picture came into focus. I wasn't him, but I'd learned enough in our years together to know when the story in front of you was bigger than it seemed. Tomorrow, I decided I'd start pulling at those threads. But tonight, I locked the tin box and put it back on the dresser. Some doors, after all, are meant to stay closed until you choose to open them. The next morning, the light over the headland was a pale, hesitant gold, the kind that makes you think it might rain after all. I'd barely taken my first sip of tea when my phone lit up with Callum's name. The timing was deliberate. He knows I'm an early riser. "Mom," he began without preamble, "we'll be down tomorrow. Can you make sure the heating's on and the fridge is stocked? Ruby's gluten-free, by the way." I swallowed the tea slowly, letting the warmth coat my throat before answering. "You sound very sure you're coming." "That's because we are." I could hear muffled voices behind him, Ruby's, high and lilting, and another I didn't recognize, Malay, with the clipped consonants of someone used to giving orders. "We've got a packed schedule once we're there. There's a sea view restaurant Ruby wants to try, some photos she needs to take for her blog." "That's lovely," I interrupted, "but I was hoping you might come for tea here in Truro on Sunday. Just the 3 of us. We could celebrate your marriage properly before you head to the coast." A beat of silence, then Ruby's voice, not even bothering to step away from the speaker. "We're busy Sunday. Just send the code. Eleanor, we'll see the place soon enough." The use of my first name made the muscles in my neck tighten. I'm sure you've got a lot on, I said evenly. But you might remember that Imogen's bringing Lily and Alfie down next week. They've had their rooms ready since Easter. Callum gave a short laugh, the kind he uses when he's trying to keep the mood light, but already feels defensive. They can skip a year or book a hotel in Penzance. They'll survive. The words landed like a pebble in my stomach, small, but heavy. You think this is just about sleeping arrangements? I asked quietly. It's a house. Mom, he said, with a kind of exasperated patience. 4 walls and a roof. You've got the flat in Truro, haven't you? You can stay there. I said propoi. Ein Prigi einkardained into the sitting room, where the low beams always make you duck, even when you don't have to. That cottage has been in our family for over 100 years. Your great-grandfather built the kitchen table from driftwood he found after a storm. That just a house is where you learned to fish, where we spent our first Christmas after your father died. Through the line, Ruby gave a little sigh. We'll look after it, she said. Better than you do. I could feel the heat rising in my face. I'd spent the better part of the past week repainting the front door in the original blue, scrubbing salt stains from the stone sills, mending the net curtains in the guest room. Better than I do. The arrogance of youth, wrapped in the certainty that the older generation is somehow in the way. I appreciate your offer, I said, each word measured, but I'd still like to meet my daughter-in-law before handing over the keys to the family home. Callum's tone sharpened. You're making this difficult. We just want some privacy. It's been a whirlwind few months. Something in that phrasing, we just want, made me think of a spoiled child clutching a toy in a shop, certain that wanting it was reason enough to have it. I took a deep breath, letting the sound of gulls outside fill the pause. Then perhaps the thing to do is to have that privacy somewhere that isn't tied up with family history. There was a muffled exchange on his end. I couldn't catch the words, but the tone was sharp. Then Callum said, You're overreacting. Ruby's made plans. She's excited, and I told her you'd be reasonable. I let the implication hang. You'll have to stop telling people what I will or won't do. It's a habit that's caused you trouble before. He huffed out a breath. Set, go for bike. Set that fat half laugh again. Mom, you've always said you want me to be happy. I do, I said. But happiness built on taking from others rarely lasts. His voice cooled. This isn't taking, it's family. And that was the crux of it, in his mind. Family meant access. In mine, it meant stewardship, holding something in trust for those who would respect it. I heard Ruby say something else, too low to catch, but it made Callum's voice harden. Fine. If you don't want to help us, we'll find another way in. There are estate agents in town who'd be happy to open up for us if we tell them we're the new owners. The casual threat made my grip tighten on the phone. You're not the owners, and anyone with the keys is acting on my behalf, not yours. Another low exchange on their end. Angus say, and dear Osprey, Sycamore Christian. He said, we'll talk later, before hanging up. The silence in the room was thick. Outside, the sun had dipped behind a bank of clouds, leaving the light flat and gray. I stood for a moment, phone still in hand, then set it on the mantel beside the clock Arthur had given me on our 15th anniversary brass. Weighty and dependable. I thought about calling Imogen, but she'd only worry, and I wanted to have more than gut instinct before I dragged her into this. Instead, I pulled the curtains just enough to see the street below. No Range Rover this morning, but a blue Mini I didn't recognize was parked opposite. Its driver, a woman in oversized sunglasses, appeared to be scrolling through her phone, but every so often her gaze lifted toward the cottage. The teapot on the hearth gave a small hiss as it cooled. I poured another cup, took it to the old writing desk in the corner, and opened the drawer where I keep the practical things: bills, insurance papers, Arthur's old Rolodex. The habit of keeping evidence close to hand was one I'd picked up from him. I'd rarely had cause to use it. I jotted down the Mini's plate number, just as I had with the Range Rover. Then, before I could talk myself out of it, I opened my laptop and began a search for North Star Resorts, for the man who'd commented on Ruby's post, for any public record that might connect them to this sudden interest in my home. The first hit was their glossy website, full of drone footage and investor testimonials. The second was a company's house listing, directors, shareholders, a string of recently dissolved shell companies. I clicked through them, noting the names, the dates, the pattern, and there, tucked in among them, was a new registration, Seaforth Developments, Ltd., formed just last month. The name made the back of my neck prickle. Seaforth was the name on our cottage's old title deeds, back when it was first registered in 1922. It wasn't a common name in this part of Cornwall. Seeing it attached to a developer's company felt like finding your own name in the obituaries. I took a photo of the screen with my phone and slid it into a folder labeled Cottage. Then I closed the laptop and sat back, listening to the slow, steady tick of the mantel clock. They thought this was just about a week's holiday. But people don't register shell companies for a holiday. And Ruby hadn't married my son in a rush because of romance alone. That much I was certain of. The first confrontation had told me two things. They were willing to push, and they believed I would yield. The next one, I decided, would need to show them they were wrong on both counts. By late afternoon, the sky had shifted from that washed-out morning gray to a brittle, bright blue that made the sea look deceptively calm. I'd been mending one of the net curtains in the guest room, the one Lily always claimed for herself, when my phone buzzed again. The message preview alone made my stomach tighten. "We'll let ourselves in if you won't. Don't be difficult." It was from Callum. Before I could process that, another came through, this time from an unfamiliar number. The display name was just Ruby, as if the sparkle emoji could soften the edges of what followed. "Your generation loves to hoard houses. We'll actually make use of it." For a moment, I sat there, needle still threaded in my hand, the sunlight pooling on the floorboards like molten gold. Outside, the tide had turned, pulling back from the rocks and revealing the dark, kelp-slick ledges. I'd spent decades learning to read those tides, when the swell would rise enough to batter the seawall, when the drop would leave the cove bare and exposed. This felt exactly like that. The water leaving, the ground beneath me laid open. I typed and deleted 3 responses before I put the phone down entirely. There are some conversations you don't have over text, especially when one side is already sharpening their words like knives. In the kitchen, I opened the dresser drawer where Arthur's old work folder sat, the leather soft from years of use. Inside were notes, clippings, and a folded sheet of paper with his handwriting across the top. Seaforth Cottage, family use only. The ink had faded, but the sentiment was as solid as the slate roof over my head. Beneath it, he'd scribbled a line in smaller letters. "Never let it be turned into a business. This is our anchor." I traced the words with my finger, remembering the day he'd written them. It was just after Callum's 10th birthday, when a property agent had come sniffing around with talk of converting the place into luxury coastal lets. Arthur had laughed them out of the gate, then come inside and put it in writing, so no one forgets where we stand. I was still holding that note when the landline rang, the sound so rare these days, it made me jump. It was Mr. Jenkins from down the slipway. Eleanor, satenta, sabanyo. Kias spinazir brio. How gay now? Iki ombre gay. Want to know. Saw a fellow with a clipboard outside your gate. Hiker cray came gay. Didn't knock. Just stood there taking pictures. Not the first time this week. Was it the Range Rover again? No. The Sigdag. Unake chose. This one was a gray Mercedes. London plates. Looked like the sort that's never hauled a net in his life. I thanked him. Ons hung up. Iantikasort a. And went to the window. No sign of the car now. But the feeling of being watched clung like damp salt air. The phone buzzed again. Callum, this time with a photo. It was the front gate, the latch unfastened, as if to prove how easily a boundary could be crossed. The caption read, "Told you, easy, see you tomorrow." I rang him immediately. He answered on the second ring, his voice bright with the false cheer he uses when he knows he's done something wrong but doesn't want to admit it. Hey, say, Mom, what exactly are you playing at? Just showing you. There's no need to be so protective. It's a house, not Fort Knox. It's my home, I said. The words clipped. Our home, he corrected, or it will be. You can't expect to keep it locked up forever. Things change. Not this, I said. Some things aren't meant to be changed. Ruby's voice floated in from somewhere nearby. She's just scared you'll make it nicer than she has. Then laughter, the kind that isn't shared, but aimed. I felt something inside me cool and harden. You didn't think to introduce her before marrying her, and now you think it's acceptable to send her here without so much as a conversation with me. She's my wife. Mum, that means she's family. Family isn't just a title you get when you sign a piece of paper, I said. It's trust, and right now, that's in short supply. He sighed. You always make things so dramatic. We just want somewhere to stay. Why are you turning this into a battle? Because you've given me no reason to believe this is about anything other than taking what you want. When you want it, for a moment, there was nothing but the sound of wind across the line. Then he said, "You'll see. Once we're there, you'll realize we're doing you a favor. Place will finally get some proper attention." I ended the call without replying. The light in the kitchen had shifted, shadows stretching long across the tiles. I stood by the counter, the note from Arthur still in my hand, and felt the weight of years pressing in. This wasn't just about a summer's use of the cottage. This was about the erosion of something Arthur and I had protected all our lives, the idea that some places belong not to profit or convenience, but to the people who have tended them. Later, as I locked the gate for the night, I noticed a fresh scuff on the wood, as if someone had tested it recently. The brass latch gleamed faintly in the last of the daylight. I pressed it down firmly, hearing the satisfying click as it caught. Inside, I made a pot of tea. I didn't really want, just for the ritual of it. On the table, beside Arthur's note, I laid out the brass keys, each one heavy with its own history. The thought of them in Ruby's hand, jangling casually in some glossy Instagram story, made my chest tighten. In that moment, the remaining hope I'd held for an amicable resolution slipped quietly away, like the tide pulling out of the cove. Whatever came next, it wouldn't be solved by polite conversation over tea. Upstairs, I pulled open the wardrobe, where I kept the old lockbox, the one Arthur had insisted on for sensitive documents. Inside were the title deeds, the insurance papers, and Stakunauker, I Salfrinand, the most recent update to my will. I ran my hand over the envelope, thinking of Imogen, of Lily and Alfie, of the summers yet to come. The wind picked up outside, rattling the window panes. I closed the lockbox and set it on the bedside table. its weight a small comfort. Downstairs, the phone remained silent, but I knew it was only a matter of time before the next message, the next push. I was done waiting for them to dictate the terms. The next move, I decided, would be mine. I didn't have to wait long for the next voice to join this growing tangle. Just after 9 the following morning, the landline rang again, that same crisp, almost formal sound that mobile phones never quite manage. It was Imogen. "Mom, I've just got out of a seminar and listened to 3 voicemails from Lily," she said, the words tumbling over one another. "She's making lists for Cornwall. You know what the first thing was? Paint shells on driftwood for her bedroom door. She's counting the days." I leaned against the kitchen counter, looking out at the garden. "Imogen," I began carefully, "there's something I need to tell you before she gets her hopes up too high." Her tone shifted, the warmth cooling into alertness. "What's happened? Your brother's married." I said, "Registry office. Yesterday, he and Ruby, that's her name, are planning to spend the next month here. Starting tomorrow." Silence, except for the faint hiss of traffic wherever she was, without telling us. "And during our week, that's what he's decided." "Decided," she repeated. "Does he think you're the booking secretary? This is the family's summer." "Mom, I told him as much." I said, "He suggested you skip a year or get a hotel in Penzance." A short, incredulous laugh escaped her. "With the kids, in July. Does he think there's a spare room in Cornwall that isn't booked until 2026? Before I could answer, the phone beeped another incoming call. The display showed Mr. Jenkins. I hesitated, then said to Imogen, "Hold a moment." I clicked over. "Eleanor, just thought you'd want to know," Mr. Jenkins said, voice low, as if passing on something illicit. "That gray Mercedes from yesterday, back again this morning. Same chap in a blazer, only this time he's got a younger woman with him, tall. Sunglasses, hair, like she's just stepped out of a salon. They were pointing at your front windows. She was taking pictures on her phone." A coldness settled in my chest. "Did she have red hair, the dark auburn?" "Yes." "Means something. That would be Ruby." There was a pause, then a muttered, "Oh, in a village, the Coinches Danquin, and Thar Anfeinchati, Seger, Onkise Krom, Jakis Tau." That follows. A name tells you exactly how quickly news will travel. Well, they drove off toward Penzance. Figured you'd want to keep an eye out. "I do. Thank you." "Tom," when I clicked back to Imogen, she'd heard enough of my side of the conversation to be bristling. "They're casing the place now, not even pretending to wait." "It looks that way," I said. She exhaled sharply. "Right. I'll bring the kids down a few days early. They can help keep watch." "That's not your job," I said. "It's family," she said simply. After we hung up, I made myself a second cup of tea, though I didn't touch it. Instead, I sat at the old writing desk and opened my notebook, not for recipes or shopping lists this time, but for a log, dates, times, sightings, Range Rover, gray, Mercedes, now the red-haired wife herself. It felt procedural, almost like the crime reports Arthur used to file. Half an hour later, my mobile buzzed with a voice note from Lily. "Grandma, I've been practicing painting seals, so when we get there, I can do one for your window. Alfie says he wants to make another kite. We still have the one from last year. Remember, the one that got stuck in the apple tree?" I played it twice, letting her voice fill the quiet kitchen. The thought of having to tell her the trip might be canceled sat like a stone in my stomach. Children don't measure summers in years. They measure them in traditions, in the things that always happen. Take one away, and the whole rhythm shifts. The next knock on the door was unexpected. When I opened it, "I crieu istement," you can say, and a craggy croakter, antre ease carried in the scent of diesel and salt. On the step stood a man in a navy fleece embroidered with harbor watch. He introduced himself as Gareth Morgan, a volunteer who kept an eye on moorings and quayside properties for owners who were away, just making the rounds. He said, but I noticed a couple of unfamiliar vehicles near here this week. One of them matched a plate from a firm that's been sniffing around properties up the coast. North Star Resorts. Ring any bells? I almost laughed at the absurdity. More than you know, he nodded, tucking his clipboard under his arm. They've been taking an interest in any place with a sea view and a bit of history. Already tried to buy out the old Hargreaves place in Mousehole. Didn't take no for an answer there. Either. Did they get it? I asked. Not yet, he said. But they've got ways of wearing people down. He gave me a look that said I might want to start thinking about how to hold my ground. When he left, I closed the door and leaned against it, the wood cool against my back. Between Imogen's outrage, Lily's hopeful voice, Mr. Jenkins' observations, Anse, Anchen Gusekin, Asin Fuchinkirid, Gareth Morgan's warning, the picture was starting to form. This wasn't just a pushy daughter-in-law with an Instagram habit. This was bigger, coordinated, and aimed squarely at my front door. I went back to the desk and underlined the words at the top of the page. Protect the cottage. Beneath it, I wrote the names Callum, Ruby, North Star Resorts, and next to them, in smaller letters, I added Imogen, Lily, Alfie, Jenkins, Morgan. Not just a list of people, but a ledger of sides. The wind picked up outside, rattling the panes. Somewhere out in the cove, a gull shrieked. It sounded almost like a warning. I picked up the phone and called Imogen back. Bring the children, I said, but don't tell them anything's wrong yet. We'll keep their summer one way or another. And as I hung up, I realized I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was starting to plan. That night, the wind had swung round from the west, carrying the smell of kelp and engine oil from the harbor. I'd been dozing in the armchair with a book slipping from my hand when a sharp metallic click pulled me awake. It wasn't the creak of old timbers or the sigh of the chimney. It was the sound of metal on metal, deliberate and close. I killed the lamp and sat still, letting my eyes adjust to the dark. From the hallway came the faint green glow of the smart lock panel by the front door, pulsing once, twice, then steadying. My stomach tightened. Whoever it was, they weren't rattling the handle. Like a chancer, they were trying codes. I reached for my phone, thumb hovering over the CCTV app. The camera over the porch came up in grainy monochrome. A tall figure stood in the wash of the motion light, hood up, head bent toward the keypad. When they glanced up, the hood slipped just enough for the porch light to catch hair, dark auburn, glossy, even in black and white. Ruby. She had her phone in one hand, something small and metallic in the other, angling it toward the panel as if she were scanning. Then, as if sensing she was being watched, she stepped back into shadow. A second figure loomed just beyond the beam, shorter, heavier, clipboard in hand. The light clicked off after 20 seconds, plunging the porch back into darkness. I sat motionless, listening for footsteps. The slam of a car door, nothing. Then, faintly, the sound of tires on gravel and the distant purr of an engine pulling away toward the main road. I saved the CCTV clip, set it to back up automatically, and added the time and description to my log. My hand was steady, now steadier than it had been all day. Suspicion had been one thing. This was something tangible. Before I could talk myself out of it, I opened my laptop and checked my email. In the junk folder, An unfamiliar subject line caught my eye. Proposal. Whitcomb, North Star Resorts. The sender's domain was a slick corporate one, but the body of the email was brief. Per our discussion with Ruby Price, please find attached preliminary render for Seaforth project. We look forward to your feedback. Attached was a PDF. When I opened it, the screen filled with a glossy 3D render of a boutique hotel. The image was almost laughably artificial sun, perpetually setting behind perfect yachts, the cliffside smoothed, as if by an overzealous sculptor. But at its center was something that made my breath stop. The footprint was my cottage, my roofline, my windows, my garden path stripped of wild roses, replaced with sleek glass balustrades, the name in curling gold letters above the door, Seaforth. I stared at it for a long moment, my jaw set. The cove in the background was empty of fishing boats. The slipway had been replaced by a cocktail terrace. It was the kind of place Ruby's Instagram followers would salivate over. It was also the kind of place that would erase every trace of the life we'd built here. At the bottom of the render, in smaller text, confidential, Gareth Whitcomb, CEO. I'd never met him, but I knew his type from Arthur's stories. Men who saw a community not as a living thing, but as a portfolio entry. I forwarded the email and attachment to my solicitor, Priya Patel, with a short note. You found this in my inbox. No idea how it got past spam filters. Thought you should see it. Then I picked up the phone and left her a voicemail to check first thing in the morning. When I set the phone down, the house felt unusually silent. Even the wind had dropped, leaving only the faint lap of water in the cove. I walked from room to room, checking each window latch, each door bolt. In the guest room, moonlight spilled across the quilt Lily had helped me choose last year, a patchwork of blues and creams. I imagined her finding strangers in this bed, her shell map taken down to make room for some impersonal canvas print, blocking back in the sitting room. I returned to the CCTV app. I rewound to just before the motion light came on. There they were again, Ruby and her companion, moving with the easy assurance of people who'd rehearsed this. The clipboard man glanced toward the camera only once, his face mostly shadow. But I caught the outline of a logo on his jacket, the same as on the email attachment. I took still frames of both of them, filed them in the log with the date and time. The kettle on the hob began to whistle. I'd said it earlier and forgotten. I poured hot water over a tea bag and carried the mug to the old dresser where Arthur's press clippings sat in neat files. It was habit, when I felt cornered, to read about people who'd stood their ground. One headline from 1989 caught my eye. Hybridaskis A.R. or Master Blocks, Development on Heritage Wharf. Arthur had covered it in his usual even-handed style, but between the lines was pride for the man who'd refused to sell. I closed the file and went back to the kitchen table. The brass keys sat where I'd left them, next to the folded note Arthur had written. I placed my hand over them, feeling the weight, the cold metal slowly warming to my skin. Upstairs, the clock in the landing struck midnight. Outside, the moon cast the headland in silver, and for a moment, the whole scene looked like one of the old photographs Arthur had taken, timeless, untouched. I thought of Ruby's render again, the smooth, soulless replacement, and felt a pulse of resolve. This wasn't just a family quarrel anymore. It was an attempted takeover, and now I had faces, a tise, inkitio, a time-stamped video, and a direct link to the company behind it, enough to start a proper counter. Before turning in, I sent a message to Imogen. Keep your eyes open when you drive down. gray Mercedes, London plates, maybe with a red-haired woman. We'll explain more when you arrive. She replied almost immediately. Understood. We'll keep watch. The house settled into its night noises, the occasional groan of timber, the faint rustle of the sea breeze through the eaves. I checked the lock on the tin box one more time, slipped Arthur's note inside, and set it back in its place. Whatever Ruby and her friends thought they were playing at, they'd just shown their hand, and I intended to make sure they regretted it. By morning, the wind had dropped to nothing, leaving the cove glassy and still. It was the kind of calm that in fishing families makes you uneasy, too quiet, too easy. My phone chimed just after 8 with a text from Martin Keene. Martin had been a friend of Arthur's since their early reporting days. Where Arthur had gone into features and culture, Martin had stayed in the murky waters of investigative work, the kind that meant keeping your name out of print. He now ran a small private investigations firm from a nondescript office above a dry cleaner's in Falmouth, and the last time I'd spoken to him was to trace a missing invoice for the Harbor Trust. The text was short. Heard about your visitors. Can talk in person. Confidential. I rang him straight back. What do you know? Not over the phone. Can you meet me at Gannett's in Penzance? Say, 10:30. Back table. 2 hours later, I was sliding into the corner booth at Gannett's Cafe, the smell of frying bacon and fresh coffee thick in the air. Martin looked the same as ever, weathered, weary, eyes that missed nothing. He had a manila folder on the seat beside him. He didn't bother with small talk. Your daughter-in-law, or whatever she's calling herself these days, is not who she says she is. I sat back. I'm listening. Name on the marriage certificate is Ruby Price, but her legal name, as of 3 years ago, is Ruth Hall. Before that, Ruth Halvorson. She's changed it twice in the past decade. I raised an eyebrow. Why daige? Why? Martin opened the folder, sliding a page toward me. It was a company's house listing from years back. For a small event, planning firm dissolved after 18 months. The director, Ruth Halvorson. That company folded, owing creditors a tidy sum. Then she turns up in London under Hall, working in hospitality. That's where she meets certain people. He laid out more photographs, grainy shots of Ruby at dinners, charity galas, on the arm of men twice her age, director of casting for one of the big production houses. Then a developer, Whitcomb, name ring a bell, Gareth Whitcomb, North Star Resorts, same. There's a photo from 3 months ago, Soho House, Dean Street, Ruby, sorry, Ruth and Whitcomb, having what looks like a cozy dinner. That's before she meets your Callum. I glanced at the timestamp, 3 months. She married Callum after what? I say, a few weeks. 4, Martin said. According to my notes, they met at a networking event in Truro, a fundraiser for the Harbor Restoration Fund. Whitcomb was one of the sponsors. You were invited, weren't you? I couldn't go. Imogen had the children. And Lily was in a school play. Well, she did, and so did Ruby. Only she wasn't on the guest list under that name. She came as Whitcomb's associate. Several witnesses remember her asking detailed questions about your cottage history, upkeep, value. The cafe noise seemed to fade under the thrum of my pulse, so she had her eye on it before she even met Callum. Martin nodded. And meeting Callum, that was the pivot. Whitcomb's reputation in development circles isn't spotless. He prefers someone else to get their name on the deed, keeps his own hands clean until the papers are signed. He produced another sheet, an email printout, from Whitcomb to his project manager, subject line, Seaforth. Once Price is married, we'll have the access we need. Keep the SPV dormant until we're ready to move. SPV, special purpose vehicle, shell company set up for one project. In this case, Seaforth Developments Ltd., the one you saw on Company's House. I leaned forward, scanning the page, and Callum knows none of this. Not according to my source. Martin closed the folder briefly, looking me in the eye. He thinks he's in love. He's being used. I let out a slow breath, the pieces locking into place like the teeth of a trap. The clipboard man with Ruby the other night, the render in my inbox, the company name lifted from my title deeds. It was all part of the same design. Martin reopened the folder to reveal one last photograph. Ruby, standing on the terrace of what looked like a restaurant by the water, in animated conversation with a man in a tailored suit. Between them on the table, blueprints taken 2 weeks ago in St. Ives. That's Whitcomb's head of acquisitions. They weren't exactly hiding. For a moment, I just stared at the photograph, the perfect smile on her face, the casual way she leaned over the plans for my home as if she already owned it. What's your advice? I asked finally. Get your solicitor to place a restriction on the title immediately. That way, nothing can change hands without your written consent, and start documenting everything. Every sighting, every call, every email. You're going to need a paper trail if this goes to court. I nodded. Already started one. He slid the folder across the table. Copies for you. Originals stay with me. And Eleanor Whitcomb doesn't lose gracefully. If he realizes you know what he's up to, expect him to push harder. I've seen his type. I said, tucking the folder into my bag. They think persistence is the same as inevitability. Not if you're more persistent. Martin said, and less predictable. We parted outside. The sun, breaking through the cloud, just long enough to throw sharp light across the wet pavement. On the drive back to the cottage, I kept replaying the dinner photo in my mind. Ruby's head tipped toward Whitcomb, their glasses of wine raised in silent toast. By the time I reached the headland, my resolve had hardened into something almost physical. They thought they'd found an easy mark, an aging mother with a sentimental attachment to an old house. What they'd actually found was a woman who'd spent 40 years watching a journalist work, who knew how to hold a story until it was ready to break. The cove was empty when I pulled in, save for Mr. Jenkins mending a net on the slipway. He lifted a hand in greeting, then nodded toward the road. Saw your red-haired friend heading toward Penzance with that blazer bloke again. Didn't wave. I smiled thinly. Next time, Tom, take a photo for me. Inside, I spread Martin's folder across the kitchen table. Names, dates, images, the architecture of a scheme that was now mine to dismantle. I added the latest sighting to my log, then took out Arthur's note and set it on top of the pile. Never let it be turned into a business. This is our anchor. If Whitcomb and Ruby thought they'd pulled the tide in their favor, they were about to learn that some anchors hold fast, no matter how hard you tug. Priya Patel called before I'd even finished my first coffee the next morning. I'd sent her the render from the mysterious email, but I hadn't given her the rest, yet the folder Martin had handed over, the photographs, the list of sightings. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. Eleanor, I've reviewed the render you forwarded, she said, voice brisk, but with that undercurrent of steel I've always admired. It's clearly your property, and the fact it's come to you, unsolicited, is concerning. We need to secure the title immediately. Have you heard of a Form RX1? Yes, I said. Arthur used 1 year ago when the Harbor Trust had a dispute over an old key lease. Exactly. It's a restriction placed with HM Land Registry. Prevents any disposition of the property without your written consent. Given what you've described, we should lodge it today. I told her about Martin's findings. The name changes. The Soho House dinner, the Sinkai, Bon Sikinshaw, Bag Shagir and for Enchase Sikias. Cottage's name on it. The email from Whitcomb's account. I could almost hear her eyebrow lifting through the line. This is coordinated, she said. And you're not dealing with amateurs. North Star has deep pockets and sharp lawyers. They'll try to create a sense of inevitability, make you feel selling, or granting access is the only option. They've already been on the property at night. I said, Ruby, and a man with a clipboard. I've got it on CCTV. Good, Priya said. Main chogite gigankor kursi de sige shay dobrigay equiye. Whereby the satisfaction of a solicitor who knows she'll have more than hearsay in her arsenal. Send me the footage and any correspondence, no matter how trivial it seems. We'll build a record. I emailed her the files while we were still on the phone. Within minutes, she was back. That clipboard man, he's in one of my old case files, worked acquisitions for a developer in Devon who tried to buy a listed manor under false pretenses. Same M. Oh, they used a personal relationship to get inside information before making a formal move. By the time I hung up, the day had already tilted into action. I printed the RX1 form from the land registry's site, the sound of the old inkjet filling the kitchen. As the pages emerged, I felt that shift from reaction to counterattack. The printer jammed on the last page, and as I wrestled with it, the post dropped through the letterbox. Most of it was the usual utility bill, circulars, A4 flyer for a boat tour, but tucked between them was a cream envelope with no return address, the handwriting sharp and unfamiliar. Inside was a single sheet of paper, headed with the logo of Seaforth Developments, Lus TD. The dormant SPV Martin had traced. The letter was addressed to residents of Seaforth Cottage and began, We are delighted to confirm preliminary interest in acquiring your property for redevelopment into a premier coastal retreat. Our initial valuation is $2, $3 million, subject to inspection. We understand you may have emotional ties, but we believe this project will bring economic benefit to the community. No signature, just a typed acquisitions team. I laughed aloud, not because it was funny, but because the brazenness was so complete, it tipped over into absurdity. They hadn't even bothered to find my name. I added the letter to my growing file, then rang Martin. He answered on the second ring. They're getting impatient, I told him and read the letter aloud. That's not a formal offer, he said. It's bait. They're hoping you'll ring them, start a conversation. They can twist into consent. They'll be disappointed. Martin cleared his throat. There's more you should see. My contact in London pulled phone records. Ruby's been in frequent contact with two numbers linked to Whitcomb's private office. Ein Cheng and Antrinke de Homos Key Kirschfrei I sent Spacier Key. One of those calls lasted 43 minutes. I got the day before your wedding announcement went online. The day before they told me. I said, exactly. And yesterday, she met with a property solicitor in Truro, same firm that handled North Star's last acquisition in Cornwall. My source says they discussed drafting a lasting power of attorney. I went cold. For Callum, that's the implication. If she gets him to grant her LPA over financial affairs, she could sign for the property if you left it to him, or even act in his name if he convinced you to add him to the title. She won't get that far, I said. After we hung up, I pulled Arthur's note from the tin box and read it again. Never let it be turned into a business. This is our anchor. My hand was steadier now. I rang Priya back. We need to talk about LPAs and forged ones. She didn't miss a beat. Do you have reason to believe they might fabricate one? I wouldn't put it past them, and I want a plan in place for if they try. We'll flag your details with the Office of the Public Guardian, she said. Any LPA application in your name will trigger direct contact with me before registration. It's not foolproof, but it's a tripwire. We hung up, and I sat in the quiet for a moment. The kettle clicked off. The clock in the hallway ticked on. The next move came from my own curiosity. I logged into Company's house again and pulled up Seaforth Developments. There, under persons with significant control, was a holding company registered in Jersey. That company, in turn, was owned by Whitcomb's Family Trust. On another tab, I opened Ruby's Instagram. A new story had gone up. A's for steak, yes for koi, boys spray, Angerbite, Igor Angoi. Tagikray the kaik. Derntgraph of a latte in a Truro cafe. You can obtain the same. The caption, paperwork day. Paperwork. I screenshotted it, filed it. By evening, the RX1 form was ready. Priya, confirming she'd lodge it first thing. That would slam one door in their faces. But I knew, from Martin's tone, that there were other doors, other angles. I was clearing the dinner plates when my mobile buzzed with an email alert. The sender was a name I didn't recognize. Daniel N. Orthstair Resorts. So, UK. The subject, next steps, Seaforth. The body was 2 lines. Gareth is eager to move this forward. Ruby assures us your son will support the proposal. Let's discuss timelines. I forwarded it to Priya and Martin. Then, on impulse, to Imogen. Her reply was swift. They think Callum is on board. Either he's lying to them or to us. We need to find out which. The truth was, I already suspected the answer. Callum wasn't malicious, but he was impulsive. And Ruby had that particular skill of making her ideas sound like his own. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with the folder open. The pages fanned out like a crime board. The render, the letter, the email, the phone records, the photographs, each a piece of a puzzle, whose picture was now unmistakable. They weren't circling. They were advancing, and every move they made was pushing me further from the line between family disagreement and outright fraud. I closed the folder and locked it in the tin box, the key cold in my hand. The cove outside was black. The only sound, the slap of water against the seawall. Somewhere in that darkness, I knew, was the thought that kept Whitcomb and Ruby awake at night. The one thing they didn't have and couldn't fake my consent. And I intended to keep it that way. By the time Imogen's car crunched onto the gravel 2 mornings later, I had everything spread across the kitchen table. Martin's photographs, Priya's notes, my logbook with its neat columns of dates and times. The cottage smelled of strong coffee and sea air. The back door was propped open to let the breeze in. Imogen stepped inside, cheeks flushed from the drive. Lily and Alfie tumbling in behind her with bags and chatter. Once the children had been steered toward the garden, we sat down. Martin arrived a few minutes later, carrying a battered leather briefcase. Priya joined via video call, her face framed by the neat shelves of her Truro office. All right, I began. We have proof they've been here without permission. Proof of contact between Ruby and Whitcomb. Proof of the development plan and evidence of their attempts to soften up Callum. We need to make sure this ends before it gets anywhere near a signature. Priya leaned forward on the screen. The RX1 restriction is lodged. That stops any transfer or charge on the property without your signed consent. But it doesn't prevent them from trying to engineer consent through Callum or by pressuring you. Martin unlatched his briefcase and pulled out a slim, sealed envelope, which is why we go on the offensive. Let's call it Plan Seaforth. Step 1. Establish the trust for Lily and Alfie. Now, make it irrevocable. That way, even if you did change your mind, which I know you won't, it couldn't be undone. Imogen's eyebrows went up. You mean skip us entirely? Yes, I said. Arthur and I always talked about the cottage being for the grandchildren. This just moves the paperwork forward. Priya nodded. We can draft the trust today. It will state the property passes directly to them on your death, with Imogen as trustee until they're 30. No power to sell for commercial use. Step 2, Martin said, is to bait them into revealing more. Eleanor, you'll send Ruby a draft agreement for a short-term license to occupy. Make it look like you're relenting. But in the fine print, include clauses that require her to confirm she holds no legal authority over you or the property, and that she recognizes the house cannot be used for commercial purposes. See if she balks. I smiled. She will, and she'll tell Whitcomb, which, Martin continued, is where step 3 comes in. I've got a contact who can drop an AirTag into an envelope you'll send her. Say it's the spare key. We'll see exactly where it goes. Imogen gave a short laugh. That's devious. Mom, it's practical, I said. Arthur always said you have to follow the paper, or in this case, the signal. Priya spoke again. Step 4 is publicity, but only if needed. I've already reached out to the editor of the West Cornwall Chronicle, off the record, to say that if a heritage property is threatened, there's a story. Martin added, Step 5 is legal deterrence. Once the trust is in place, we'll send Whitcomb a formal notice that any further attempts to approach you, your family, or your property will be treated as harassment. We hashed out the details for an hour. The children's laughter drifted in through the open door, a reminder of what was at stake when we'd agreed on the wording for the trust and the license document. Priya promised to have drafts by evening. After the call ended, Martin stayed behind. One more thing, be ready for them to escalate. If they think they're losing, they may try to discredit. You make you look unfit to manage your affairs. They'd have to fabricate a lot to get there. I said, they've already fabricated a marriage built on lies. Martin replied, don't underestimate their creativity. When he'd gone, I took a walk down to the slipway. The tide was high, the boats bobbing against their moorings. Mr. Jenkins was mending a net on his bench. And he looked up as I passed. Heard you've got a plan, he said. In a village, news travels faster than the tide. Something like that. I said, good. That lot from North Star don't like it when people dig in their heels. He gave the netting a sharp tug, as if to illustrate the point. Back at the cottage, I sat at the table again, looking at the tin box with Arthur's note inside. The idea of sending Ruby anything, even a fake license, made my stomach knot. But it was the only way to see the full shape of their intentions. By late afternoon, Priya's draft was in my inbox. The trust document was clean, airtight, full of clauses that would make Whitcomb's team wince. The license looked innocuous on the surface dates, basic conditions, but in the middle of the second page was the trap. The licensee warrants that they hold no legal authority over the licensor or her property, including, but not limited to any lasting power of attorney, and acknowledge that the premises shall not be used for any commercial purpose or in connection with any commercial development proposal. I printed both. The trust documents went into the tin box. The license I folded neatly into an envelope. Martin would collect it in the morning to add the tracker. As evening settled, the children came in from the garden. hair windblown, cheeks flushed. Lily handed me a shell she'd found, perfect and unbroken, for your desk, Grandma, so you can think of the sea when you're working. I turned it over in my hand, feeling the ridges. I'll keep it somewhere safe, I said, and meant it. That night, as I locked the front door, I thought about the steps we'd set in motion. They thought they were the hunters, moving in for the kill. But tomorrow, when Ruby opened her envelope, the game would start to turn, and I was ready for it. Martin arrived just after breakfast, the air tag already hidden in the hollow of an old brass key he'd sourced from a reclamation yard. Looks the part, weighs the part, he said, placing it in my palm. Once she opens the envelope, it'll start pinging every time it moves. I slid the key into the envelope with the folded license document, sealing it with the same neat press Arthur used to give our Christmas cards. We wrote "Private and Confidential" on the front in a hand formal enough to tempt curiosity. Imogen watched from the kitchen doorway, arms folded. You're sure you want to do this? It's giving them a foot in the door. Even if it's a fake one, it's bait, not a gift, I said. And if we want to know where this leads, we have to let them think they're leading it. Martin took the envelope to post in Truro, so it would look like it had come through ordinary channels. By noon, I'd received the tracking notification. The AirTag was live. The blue dot stayed stubbornly in the sorting office until just before 4, when it began to move steadily east along the A30. By early evening, it pinged from an address in Islington, Ruby's flat. 10 minutes later, the dot moved again. Only this time, it stopped in a part of town I knew well enough from Arthur's London days, the riverfront offices of North Star Resorts. I called Martin. They've taken it straight to Wickham. Good, he said. Now we know the chain. While we tracked, I also waited for Ruby's reply. It came the next morning in a chirpy text. Thanks for sending the agreement. We'll review with Callum and get back to you. Looks straightforward. Priya, who I'd looped into the tracking updates, read the message and said if she returns, it's signed without striking that clause. It's an admission she has no authority and knows it. If she refuses, she's confirming they intended to use some air. That afternoon, the AirTag's trail took an unexpected turn. From North Star's glassy HQ, it traveled to a law firm in the city. I Googled the address corporate property specialists, the same firm Martin had mentioned from his Devon case. The key stayed there for 3 hours before returning to Islington. Imogen, leaning over my shoulder to watch the map, murmured, they're either checking if they can use it or planning how to get around your clause. By Friday morning, the dot was on the move again, this time to St. Ives. I called Mr. Jenkins to see if the gray Mercedes or the red hair had been spotted. Not yet, he said, but there's been a chap with a drone flying over the headland. Not local. I added it to the log, along with the AirTag's coordinates. Martin advised patience. They're testing you as much as you're testing them. Let them think you're passive. Late that afternoon, Ruby rang. Her voice was bright, almost sing-song. Eleanor, we've looked over your little license. It's interesting. I'm not sure about that bit in the middle. The no commercial use thing. I mean, you never know when a place might benefit from a few improvements. That clause stays, I said. Her tone tightened. We'll have to think about it. You do that, I replied, and ended the call. 5 minutes later, the AirTag pinged from a cafe in Penzance, a place where you could sit in the back and have a long conversation without being overheard. The dot didn't move for nearly 2 hours. When it did, it went straight back to North Star's HQ. That night, over fish pie with Imogen and the children, I kept my phone face down on the table. I free, Saint-Chi, Pahoy, Horkriki, Frogri, Gato Creature, and I said, though my thoughts kept drifting to that blue dot, each move it made was another thread in the web. Before bed, I sent Martin the day's log, then went to the tin box and laid Arthur's note on top of the folder. I could almost hear his voice in the quiet. You don't catch them by chasing, Rosie. You catch them by waiting where they're heading. And now I knew exactly where they were heading. By Sunday morning, the weather had turned sharp gusts, rattled the sash windows, and sent bursts of spray over the seawall. I was halfway through folding the breakfast tablecloth when the first sign of panic arrived. Not from Ruby, but from Callum. Mom, what's going on? His voice was tight, the edge of someone who's been cornered. Ruby says you've sent her some ridiculous contract, and now Gareth's furious because you're blocking plans that could have helped everyone, or helped who? Exactly, I asked, keeping my voice even. You, the family, the village, do you have any idea how much they're offering? You could move into something modern. No damp, no drafts. This isn't about damp. I cut in. It's about a developer carving up what doesn't belong to him. There was a pause, long enough for me to picture Ruby pacing in the background. Then her voice, loud enough to carry through. She's making a mistake. She'll regret. I've heard that before, I said, and ended the call. Not half an hour later, the AirTag pinged from Truro, the law firm again, then started moving west at speed. By midday, it was in the car park of the only decent hotel in Penzance. I rang Martin. They're consolidating, he said, probably meeting with their local agents, working out if they can put something through before your restriction is fully processed. Priya says the RX-1 is already on the register, so they're wasting their time, but they don't know that yet. At 3 o'clock, my phone buzzed with an email from an unknown Gmail address. The subject line, final chance. The body was a single sentence. Sign over the keys this week, or we will take steps you won't like. No name, no signature, but the phrasing reeked of someone used to intimidation by implication. I forwarded it to Priya and Martin, then printed a copy for my file. By late afternoon, the AirTag's blue dot moved again, this time to the Headland car park. I stepped to the upstairs window in time to see the gray Mercedes pull in, followed by a black SUV I didn't recognize. Ruby got out first, hair whipping in the wind, phone pressed to her ear. Whitcomb followed, his tailored coat incongruous against the salt spray. They didn't come to the door. Instead, they stood by the seawall, pointing toward the cottage, talking in clipped gestures. Then, in a moment that made the hairs on my arms lift, Whitcomb took a folded sheaf of papers from his coat and held them up to show her. Even from here, I recognized the header, a land registry printout. I called Priya immediately. They've got documents. Looks like a title search. Let them waive papers all they like, she said. The restrictions in place. They're testing you. The pair stayed another 10 minutes, then drove off, the Mercedes leading, the SUV close behind. I wrote the time and details in my log, adding that Whitcomb had looked up at the cottage windows more than once. After dark, the phone calls began. First, from a withheld number, silence, then a click. Then from a London line, Ruby again, her voice tight, almost shrill. You've made things very difficult. Eleanor, Gareth doesn't like having his time wasted. Then he should stop wasting mine, I said, and hung up. 5 minutes later, another call, this time from Callum. Mom, can you please just be reasonable? Ruby's in tears. Gareth's saying you've embarrassed him in front of his investors. Do you want me to be blacklisted in my own career because of a house? I could hear the desperation in his voice. Now, not for me, but for himself. If your career rests on taking something that doesn't belong to you, I said. You need a different career. There was a sharp intake of breath. Then the line went dead. By 9, the AirTag pinged from St. Ives again. I imagined them hunched over their blueprints, recalculating, trying to find a way around the wall I'd built. Panic doesn't always look like shouting. Sometimes it's a sudden frenzy of activity. Too many moves made too fast. At 10, Martin texted, "Got a friend at the hotel bar in Penzance." Whitcomb was overheard saying, "She'll crack. They always do. Pisse chunsto." Friend says he's rattled. I closed the curtains, double-locked the door, and set the kettle on. Out on the headland, the wind howled, but in here, the cottage was warm. The children upstairs whispering in the twin beds. They could circle all they liked, throw their threats and their false promises. But the more I saw of them in this state, exposed, scrambling, the more I knew the tide was turning. And it was only a matter of time before they'd make the mistake that would end it. The opportunity came faster than I expected. Monday morning, Martin rang just after 7. "They're in the village." "Hi," he said. "Gray Mercedes and the SUV. Parked outside the Harbor View Cafe. Ruby, Whitcomb, and your son?" "My contact says they've booked the back room for a private meeting." Imogen was in the kitchen with me, pouring cereal for the children. She looked up sharply when she heard. "You're going?" I nodded. With the file, we left the children with Mrs. Carver from next door, the sort who could frighten off a solicitor with a look, and walked the short way down the hill. The cafe's bell jangled as we stepped inside, the smell of strong tea and fried bread wrapping around us. The waitress gave a small nod toward the back. They were exactly as Martin had described, Callum looking uneasy, Ruby perfectly composed in a cream coat, Whitcomb in a navy suit that screamed London boardroom. A spread of papers lay on the table between them, and I recognized the same land registry printout from their car park visit. I didn't wait for an invitation. I pulled out the chair opposite Whitcomb and set my folder on the table. "You've been busy," I said. Ruby's smile was tight. "We were going to call you. I imagine you were." I opened the folder, sliding the top sheet forward, a color print of the render they'd sent me by mistake. "Recognize this." Whitcomb barely glanced at it. "A concept, nothing more, complete with my roofline, my window pattern, and my garden path," I said. "You've also been on my property after dark. That's called trespass." I flipped to the stills from the CCTV. "This is you, Mrs. Price, or should I say Hall, Halvorsen, whichever name you're using this month." Callum's head jerked toward her. "What?" Ruby's cheeks colored, but her voice stayed smooth. "The Chigurther is fine. Those are ancient history, irrelevant." I placed the next page, down Martin's printout of the company's house, listing for Seaforth Developments Ltd., with the Jersey Holding Company and Whitcomb's Trust in bold. "Dormant shell, set up last month. Care to explain why it's named after my cottage?" Whitcomb's jaw tightened. Business planning. We identify potential opportunities and groom my son to be your point of access. I cut in. "You didn't even hide it well. I've got your email to your project manager. Once Price is married, we'll have the access we need." Callum's face went pale. "Gareth." Whitcomb's gaze flicked to him, then back to me. "Emails can be fabricated. Then perhaps you'd like to explain the AirTag I sent to Ruby." "Now sitting in your office," I said, sliding my phone across to show the tracking log. "Every stop you've made with it, including the law firm in the city and the meeting in St. Ives over blueprints." Imogen leaned forward, her voice low and steady. "You should also know the property is now in trust for my children. Irrevocable. Even if Eleanor wanted to sell, she couldn't. The land registry restriction is active as of last week. Ruby's composure cracked a tiny flicker in her eyes before the smile snapped back into place. That's unfortunate. Whitcomb sat back, calculating. There's always room for negotiation. Not on this, I said. What you've done, the misrepresentation, the pressure, the trespass, I have enough to go to the police. But I'm offering you a choice. You leave Cornwall today, and you never contact me, my family, or my solicitor again. In return, I don't make public how you operate. You wouldn't dare, Ruby said, but her voice lacked the earlier certainty. Martin stepped in from the doorway. Then I hadn't realized he'd followed us down. He held up his phone, already sent the file to 2 journalists. If Eleanor calls me in an hour and says you've gone, I'll tell them it was a misunderstanding. If not, he shrugged. You know how quickly a headline can travel. Callum looked between us, realization dawning in the slump of his shoulders. You used me, he said to Ruby. All of this, it was never about us. Was it, Ruby didn't answer. Whitcomb reached for his papers, stacking them with precise movements. We'll go, and you'll put it in writing, I said, sliding a single sheet toward him. Priya had drafted it for exactly this moment. A cease and desist agreement forbidding any further approach or contact, with a clause acknowledging they had no claim on the property. He read it, then signed with a single, sharp stroke. Ruby added her name in a tight hand. I gathered the papers, slid them into my folder, and stood, safe journey back to London. They left without another word. The ikasti garkan kimpai ki ankri baung by Gary, by bell above the cafe door, jangling in their wake. For a long moment, none of us spoke. Then Imogen exhaled. You think that's the last we'll see of them? Of those 2? Probably, I said. But there'll always be another Whitcomb somewhere. That's why the trust matters. Callum stood slowly, his face a mix of shame and relief. Mum, I'm sorry. I didn't say it was all right. It wasn't, but I put a hand on his shoulder. Just don't make me choose between you and this place again. When we stepped back out into the street, the wind had dropped and the sun was breaking through the clouds, lighting the harbor in gold. The tide was turning, and for the first time in weeks, it was turning in my favor. Word travels quickly in a fishing village, and by the time we'd walked back up the hill from the Harbor View Cafe, half the harbor seemed to know that Whitcomb and his glamorous associate had been sent packing. Mrs. Carver was waiting on my garden path, her apron still dusted with flour. They've checked out of the Harbor View already, she said, with the satisfaction of someone who's watched enough dramas to know when the villain's been beaten. Mercedes and that black monstrosity gone by 1 o'clock. Jenkins says they didn't even finish their tea. I let her in on just enough detail to satisfy her curiosity without risking the more sensitive parts of Martin's file. She patted my arm. You did right. Can't let outsiders come in thinking they can rearrange what's been here for generations. That afternoon, Priya rang with an update. The signed cease and desist is enforceable, she said. If they breach it, we can go straight to court for an injunction without further warning. I've also filed a harassment notice with the local police. They'll keep it on record in case you get so much as a postcard from them. Martin followed with his own report. 2 sources in London say Whitcomb's been temporarily relieved of his development duties, investor pressure, something about him being a liability in sensitive acquisitions. Ruby hasn't been seen in his office since Monday. She's back in London, keeping her head down. It was oddly quiet in the days that followed. No unfamiliar cars at the headland. No strange knocks on the door. The AirTag stopped pinging entirely. Imogen and the children stayed the week, and the house filled with the normal sounds of summer kettle whistles, gull cries, the thud of little feet on the stairs. One morning, Lily appeared in the kitchen with a shoebox she'd been filling with shells and bits of sea glass. "This is for when we're not here," she said solemnly. "So the cottage still remembers us." I promised her it would. "Dat dine is zeker gekeken, das de trushin, dursikbro." Oh, in truth, I felt it was the other way around, the cottage remembering all of us, holding each summer like a pressed flower in its walls. On Thursday, Callum came alone. He stood awkwardly in the doorway, hands deep in his pockets. "I've split with Ruby," he said. "It was all fake. I should have seen it. I made tea." And we sat in the sitting room where the afternoon sun pooled across the rug. He talked, haltingly, about the lies, the pressure, the little manipulations that only made sense in hindsight. When he left, I didn't forgive him outright, but I did send him away with a loaf of Mrs. Carver's bread and a promise that the door wasn't closed forever. The village seemed to rally in quiet ways. Jenkins dropped off a fresh mackerel catch in case the shops run out. The postmistress kept a copy of the cease and desist under the counter just to show folk who ask. Even the editor of the West Cornwall Chronicle sent a note. "Heard you gave London a bloody nose." Well done. The only tangible reminder of the siege was the tin box in the dresser, now containing not just Arthur's note and the keys, but a thick sheaf of signed documents. The trust, the restriction, the agreement that had sent Whitcomb and Ruby back up the A30 in defeat. Late one evening, after the children were in bed and the house had settled into its night noises, I stepped outside. The tide was high, the water black and gleaming under a half moon. I could see the faint glow of St. Ives across the bay. But here, the only light came from the cottage windows. It struck me then how close it had come, how easily, without Martin's call, Priya's urgency, Imogen's loyalty, it could have gone the other way. And how, without the quiet strength of the place itself, I might not have found the grit to hold my line. Some battles you win in courtrooms, others in boardrooms. This one had been won in kitchen chairs and cafe back rooms, with patience, proof, and a little well-timed theater. The next morning, I put Arthur's note back in its place at the top of the tin box and locked it. Outside, the gulls wheeled in the clear blue sky. Ein Kindin, Salkisekas, ein Teen, ein Kerbing der Onkin and Beisau. Beisei. Dove Lily and Alfie's laughter carried on the wind. The storm had passed. By mid-August, the rhythm of the cottage had returned to something like normal. Mornings began with the creak of the stair treads, the kettle's first whistle, and the slap of the tide against the seawall, the absence of surveillance. No gray Mercedes, no unfamiliar drones felt strange at first, like a sudden silence after weeks of constant background noise. But slowly, the quiet became comfortable again. Imogen and the children stayed through the end of the school holidays. We rebuilt small traditions, as if shoring up seawalls after a storm. Lily painted her driftwood sign, Lily's room, no boys, and hammered it onto the guest room door. Alfie mended last year's kite with tape and string, then insisted we fly it on the headland. We picnicked on the beach, huddled under blankets when the sea mist rolled in, and baked the same ginger biscuits Arthur used to make, their scent filling the kitchen in the late afternoons. The legal defenses around the cottage quietly grew stronger too. Priya registered the trust formally with the Charity Commission, which meant that not only was it irrevocable, but it carried a small heritage designation that would make any future commercial change far more complicated. The RX-1 restriction stayed in place, and Priya also filed a caution with the land registry that would trigger an alert if anyone so much as looked at the title. One bright Tuesday, a padded envelope arrived from Martin. Inside was the AirTag key tracker removed and a note. No further pings. Consider this chapter closed. Keep the key as a memento or as a reminder. I hung it on the cottage's old key rack beside the spare shed key. Callum wrote once, a letter in his own awkward hand. He didn't ask to visit yet, just said he was looking for work outside Whitcomb's circle and trying to figure out who I am without other people's plans in my head. I put the letter in the tin box. I wasn't ready to trust him with the cottage, but I wanted him to know the door to reconciliation wasn't locked forever. On the first evening after Imogen and the children left, the house felt suddenly too still. I lit the fire, though it wasn't cold enough to need it, and took my tea to the bench outside. The sunset painted the sky in deep pinks and golds, the same colors that had framed Arthur's last photograph of the headland. I thought about how easily that view could have been lost behind glass balconies and cocktail terraces. Losing the cottage would have meant more than losing 4 walls and a roof. It would have meant losing a center point, the place where our family's threads were tied together. Now, with the trust sealed and the cease and desist in force, it felt anchored more securely than it had in years. The village, too, seemed lighter. People stopped me in the high street to say they'd heard what happened, always in vague terms. Never Cormac. Never pushing for details, but with a glint of approval in their eyes. At the Saturday market, Mrs. Carver pressed a jar of marmalade into my hands for keeping the place safe. Jenkins left a freshly coiled rope on my doorstep with no note at all. One afternoon, I took out the folder from the tin box and laid the papers in a neat stack on the table. The cease and desist, the trust document, the RX1 receipt, Arthur's note. I read each in turn, not because I needed to remember the fight, but because I wanted to see the chain, from start to finish, suspicion to proof, proof to action, action to security. When I was done, I returned everything to its place and locked the tin box. The key went back in my apron pocket, the way Arthur used to keep it. By the time the September wind came, curling round the headland and rattling the shutters, I knew the recovery was real. The cottage was safe. The family ties, though, bruised, were intact, and my own footing felt steadier than it had in months. The siege had ended, but what it left behind was a sharper sense of where the lines were and how to hold them. And when I heard Lily's voice on the phone, already planning next summer's sign for her door, I smiled. The anchor was holding. Autumn came in with its slow, deliberate steps, bracken turning bronze on the headland, the nights stretching further into the mornings. With the children back at school and Imogen busy in Exeter, the cottage settled into its quiet season. I found myself lingering over small rituals, polishing the brass latch on the gate, folding away the summer quilts, taking the long way back from the harbor just to hear the sea breathing against the rocks. One blustery afternoon, I sat at the kitchen table with a pot of tea, the tin box open in front of me. Inside, everything was as it should be. Arthur's note on top, the trust documents, the cease and desist, the RX1 confirmation, proof, not just of what had been attempted, but of what had been stopped, proof that sometimes standing still is the most powerful move you can make. It struck me that the real battle had never been about a building, not entirely. The cottage was bricks and mortar, yes, but it was also years of birthdays and summers and late-night talks. It was Arthur's hand on the banister, Lily's driftwood sign, the way the kitchen smelled of ginger biscuits in August. That was what I'd been defending, a living thing, not a structure. And the lesson, if there was one worth passing on, was this: you can't assume that the things you love will be safe simply because they've always been there. In a world where every view can be bought and sold, where people will smile at you while they measure your windows, you have to be your own first line of defense. Know where your boundaries are. Put them in writing. Don't wait until someone else has drawn the map for you. That doesn't mean living suspicious of everyone. It means being ready to say no without apology, ready to gather allies, ready to turn the tables if you have to. Most of all, ready to outlast the storm, because storms do pass. And when they do, you want your anchor to still be holding. I thought about Callum then. We hadn't spoken in weeks, but I'd heard through Imogen that he'd found work with a marine conservation charity. Maybe losing Ruby had been the first step in learning what he actually valued. Maybe one day, when the dust settled properly, we'd talk about the cottage again, not in terms of ownership or rights, but of what it meant to us both. As for Whitcomb and Ruby, they'd vanished from our corner of the world entirely. North Star had moved on to some glossy scheme in Portugal. In the Chronicle, a small piece on page 4 mentioned a reshuffle in leadership without names. It was enough to make me smile. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters. I closed the tin box, locked it, and set it back on the dresser. My tea had gone cold, but I didn't mind. There was a fire to light, a stew to start, ensemble, and ICC. Sure work of keeping the cottage ready for whoever came through its door in the years ahead, on my terms. When I stepped outside, the air was sharp with salt, the sea dark under the pewter sky. Somewhere far below, the tide was turning again. I stood for a moment, letting the wind push my hair back from my face, and felt the solid ground beneath my feet. The fight had been worth it, not because I'd won, but because the place and the life tied to it was still mine to live. And that, I thought, was the only kind of victory that matters. At its heart, this story is about safeguarding what truly matters, not just bricks and mortar, but the memories, values, and sense of belonging that a place can hold. In a world where sentiment is often undervalued and everything seems to have a price, it's a reminder that some things should remain beyond the reach of opportunists, no matter how persuasive their words or how polished their promises. For many of us in later life, we've spent decades building not only a home, but a legacy, a safe harbor for family. I vin quoi que say. Olivia, living record of our history. The lesson is clear. Do not wait until someone tests your boundaries to define them. Put your wishes in writing, protect them legally, and be willing to stand your ground with calm resolve. Surround yourself with people you trust, and don't be afraid to ask for help when the tide turns against you. If you take nothing else from this, let it be that your voice and your no carries power. You are the best steward of your own story, and the decisions you make now will shape how it is remembered. If there's something in your life worth protecting, act today, strengthen it, share your intentions with those who matter, and put the safeguards in place so it stands strong long after you. May you always have the courage to defend your anchor, the wisdom to see through false promises, and the peace of knowing that what you cherish is safe. Stay well and take care.